meat-based carnivore diets, and some of the concerns is, oh my God, I'm going to have a heart attack because my cholesterol might go high. And it's an unrelenting fear that people have. I continuously get that question. I try to be a little nuanced about it, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that particular topic, if you don't mind.
Yeah, first of all, I can't take credit. So I actually first learned about this idea from Malcolm Kendrick, and he from one of his Scottish professors, I believe. There's been smart people that have come before who have laid this pathway. But before we get on to this actual theory, the elephant in the room is that the reason that we demonize red meat, one of them is largely because it contains saturated fat. And there's this fear that you eat saturated fat, your cholesterol levels in your blood will rise and you'll die of a heart attack. So the first point that I'd make is that there is no known mechanism by which saturated fat can actually increase blood cholesterol levels. I mean, that probably sounds quite shocking because we've all heard this repeated ad nauseum, end on end. And the simple truth is there's not one defined mechanism by which saturated fat in the diet can increase the level of cholesterol, LDL, IDL, VLDL, whatever you talk about. There's no mechanism by which it can actually increase it. There's two factors at play here. There's some factors that lower cholesterol and some factors that raise cholesterol. Now, the main factor that lowers cholesterol is something called fake plant cholesterol, called phytosterols. Basically, it's very similar to real human cholesterol, the human cholesterol that we make testosterone out of, that every cell membrane depends on its survival for, thyroid hormone, all of these things that depend on cholesterol. The fake plant cholesterol will disturb the normal physiological functioning, which is a good thing. And the body understands this because it rejects the vast majority of these plant-based chemicals coming in our diet. And by the way that most people get the highest dose of these fake cholesterols is in seed oils and vegetable oils, including coconut oil. So the body will only allow you to absorb 1 or 2%, which is a good thing. And interestingly enough, we've got some diseases where people through genetic mutations actually overabsorb this. Their body isn't very effective at keeping these plant sterols out. That condition is called cytosterolemia. And that condition is defined as early, premature, same thing, severe atherosclerotic disease. So people think people having heart attacks in their 30s. And that's because of this fake plant cholesterol, which seed oils, vegetable oils are incredibly rich in. Now, one of the things that these do, because they interfere with the normal function of cholesterol, they lower your cholesterol level. So now think what happens. Somebody's on a standard Western diet. They're just chowing down massive amounts of these fake plant cholesterols, and then they eliminate them from their diet and replace them with saturated fat. What's going to happen to their cholesterol level?
Well, you assume if it's suppressing it, it would cause it to rise, correct? Right? It's
going to go up. So you've got the appearance that cholesterol is going up. But in actual fact, in that situation, what's happening is that your cholesterol is just being restored to a normal, healthy physiological level. One thing that we can't ignore is that we have this U-shaped mortality curve with cholesterol levels. And we know that people, when their cholesterol goes low, then their risk of death is actually significantly, statistically elevated. But when their cholesterol passes a certain point, their risk of mortality, it's not as steeply rising, but it still does rise. So that does indicate that there's some factors which could cause cholesterol to go high that may be deleterious. Now, we know it's not saturated fat because there's no mechanism for that. But there's other things that we do know cause it to go higher. For example, if anybody's sitting in front of a computer now, Google B12 and cholesterol synthesis, and you'll see that the mechanism and the proof that B12 deficiency leads to an increase in cholesterol biosynthesis, this is well established. Same is true for folate. So let's say, for example, so these people with slightly elevated cholesterol levels who are exhibiting that increase in mortality, they may be having some nutrient deficiency. Now, it can also be inflammation. There's what we call inflammatory cytokines, these little chemicals that swim around in your blood, and they're associated with inflammatory states like autoimmune disease. And one of them is called tumor necrosis factor alpha. We've got pretty solid evidence that TNF alpha is a direct driver of cholesterol synthesis. And here's the kicker. So we've identified that some people on ketogenic and carnivore style diets, their cholesterol levels rise beyond the pale. It's not just to a level where we say that's just a return of normal physiological levels, but they're skyrocketing. And in some of those cases, in some of my patients, what I'm actually identifying is that some of the foods which they've been consuming on carnivore, ketovore style diets are actually triggering inflammation. Not everything that derives from animal is actually necessarily a good food for everybody. Mm-hmm. The number one culprit is actually dairy. And it doesn't matter if it's A1 or A2 dairy. We know that dairy consumption for genetically susceptible individuals will exacerbate autoimmune disease. And autoimmune disease, we're talking about the immune system actually attacking your own body. Your immune system's just meant to protect you from foreign pathogens. So if you have a little virus that enters your bloodstream, your immune system's meant to look at that and say, hey, you're not from these parts. I'm going to deal with you. Now, the problem is if your immune system looks at a cell of your own body and mistakes the identifying barcode on that cell. Every cell in our body has a different barcode. It's what we call a glycoprotein, particular molecular sequence. And if it mistakes the glycoproteins or the identifying molecules on your cells for a foreign cell, what we call molecular mimicry, it will attack that by mistake. And dairy is one of the food groups that most strongly triggers autoimmune disease. And I think the best example, the most interesting example I have, funnily enough, this is totally coincidental. I just happen to have this sitting on my desk right here. And this is a little study. This was published on the 9th of March in 1931. It's the studies on nutrition, and it compares two African tribes, what they refer to that as the Akukuyu and the Maasai. And these two tribes were very interesting. But basically, the English went along, they colonized, they wanted to boost economic productivity. And they said, we can make these tribes more productive if they're healthier. Maybe nutrition has something to do with it. So, and they had this beautiful ecological study just waiting to be done. They had the Maasai warriors, the warrior-aged males who would consume meat and dairy only, compared to the Akukuyu, who were largely a vegetarian tribe. And they were genetically similar because they were intermixing via marriage. So beautiful study. And what they found, no surprise. So if I go to, I think it's page 9. So the survey of the two tribes showed that the diet of the Maasai consisted to a large extent of milk, meat, and raw blood, and the Akukuyu mainly of cereals, roots, and fruits. The outstanding points of difference, blah, 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 blah. And then physical measurements showed that the full-grown Maasai male is 5 inches taller, 23 pounds heavier, and his muscular strength, as determined by the dynamometer, is 50% greater. Marked differences were found in the incidence of disease in the two tribes: bony deformities, dental caries, anemia, pulmonary conditions, and tropical ulcer being much more prevalent amongst the Akukuyu. But here's the kicker. On the other hand, intestinal stasis and rheumatoid arthritis were more common amongst the Maasai. And if we actually went and had a look at the data, they actually measured something called the rheumatoid factor, which is one of these proteins produced by your body when it's trying to attack itself. And I believe the factor that defines that, so we know the fact that they were on a low-carb, high-protein diet, that led to them being tall and strong and metabolically healthy, but they had these autoimmune issues triggered by the dairy. Now, first of all, let's talk briefly about the intestinal stasis, constipation. So people may not know this, but morphine is very constipating. So opiates, these drugs were derived from poppies. In medical school, we were taught the hand that writes the script for the opiate writes the script for the laxative. We know that these opiates are incredibly constipating. What most people probably don't realize is that dairy contains morphine. There's something called casomorphine. It's natural, and that's why dairy is so delicious, to the point of addiction for a lot of people. So when people go on these ketogenic and carnivore diets, they're often consuming loads and loads of dairy. Dairy becomes the replacement for sugar. So that warm hug we get when we eat sugar, that releases dopamine into the mesolimbic pathway of our brain. We take sugar away, we need to get that from somewhere else. where do we get it? We often turn to dairy. So people often go into these diets consuming copious amounts of dairy. And believe it or not, that is one of the most significant triggers for autoimmune disease, is that we tend to think of autoimmune disease as being incredibly different to each other. So we're trying to compare multiple sclerosis to type 1 diabetes to rheumatoid arthritis. But in actual fact, the root cause of these diseases is incredibly similar. The difference between rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, so one that affects the lining, the insulation of the brain, the oligodendrocytes, and one that affects the joints, the synovium within the joints. The only difference is that the immune attackers, the antibodies and cells like that, T cells and B cells, they just recognize a different barcode. They're basically exactly the same effectors. They're just reading a different barcode. And reading a different barcode means that they can attack an entirely different tissue. And this is why when we talk about autoimmune diseases, we talk about them in clusters. It's well known that if you've got one autoimmune disease, you're far more likely to have another autoimmune disease. They're like Pokemon. Once you got one, you got to get them all. So and while this can be quite depressing, you think, holy crap. And when I start testing patients, if they come in with Hashimoto's and we say, oh, you've got antibodies against your pancreas and use a bit of antibody against your joints and so on and so forth. The wonderful thing is that the treatment for one is effectively and usually relatively effective for others. I think the best evidence comes from a study. They looked at people with celiac disease who went gluten-free, but then they still had problems. And they said maybe there's something else in their diet that's causing a similar reaction to the gluten. So they tested for cross-reactivity to gliadin, which is the reactive component in most parts of gluten. And what they actually found, that there was 3 components within dairy that were significantly problematic. Casein was by far the worst. And of all different food components or antigens, casein was the worst across all the food types they tested. But whey protein was also reactive to a degree, and that morphine type substance that we talked about. And there was a couple of other substances within the dairy that slipped my mind. So it's not just casein, and people being in your field, my field, they say, oh, I need extra protein and they want to get on the whey protein. And we know from the evidence that's an excellent whey. It's an excellent mTOR stimulator. Whey protein's got a complete complement and is very effective. But for people with autoimmune issues, it might be problematic. So if we sort of circle back and the question that you said, when we see some people whose cholesterol goes very high, one of the most common dietary causes I see is dairy driving that. And the first thing I have my patients do is to strictly eliminate dairy from their diet. And it breaks a lot of hearts, but that includes butter. And for life, I'm not sure why people tend to think of butter, putting butter on a pedestal. That doesn't count. That comes from other milk, I guess. But it absolutely does include butter. People do react to butter. And I don't fully appreciate the reasoning why, but some people even react to ghee, which is theoretically had most of the proteins removed from it. I'm guessing there's still some of these chemicals and some proteins that are not completely removed even from ghee. So there's an autoimmune condition called eosinophilic esophagitis, which is sort of a prototypical autoimmune disease that affects the gastrointestinal tract. But it's very easy to study because we can just whack a camera down your mouth and have a look at the esophagus, and we can do biopsies and samples on it. So they've actually what we call histological remission of this disease, where they actually cut a bit of the tissue out, look at it under a microscope and say, oh, those inflammatory cells have disappeared. So they've actually, through empirical, basically trial and error research, found that there's 6 different food types that will predominantly trigger eosinophilic esophagitis. And the study which I refer most commonly to showed that when people simply eliminate those 6 foods from their diet with this proven disease, about 73% of them will induce and maintain a prolonged histological remission, which is pretty impressive. Those 6 foods, though, include things that carnivores commonly consume. So milk is there. So nuts and seeds is also there. And people often forget that coffee is a seed. Mm-hmm. Coffee will absolutely trigger those reactions. And the third one is fish and seafood, which really blows a lot of people's minds. Now, I actually personally add pork to that list as well for a lot of people. So we talked about cross-reactivity before, and there's a lot of people with cat dander allergies and animal danders. And for some reason, there seems to be something about pork meat that leads to a cross reaction with some of the animal danders. If I'm noticing people are still particularly inflamed, even on a carnivore style diet, the things that we'll look at in terms of hierarchy will be dairy, coffee, fish, seafood, also eggs. I forgot to add eggs to the list. And this is another one that people are often very surprised about.